What's going on, everybody? It's going to be a quick recap of the day. I wanted to give you guys some tips and tricks on how to use these composite volume profiles in your trading. I think today is a great example of how you can use them. So when you have this overlapping value, like we had the last 3 to 4 days, it gives you a good reason to throw up a composite profile instead of just using the individual profiles of that day, right? Typically we use the full session profile of that entire day. We could also use the pre-market profile as well. But when you have these overlapping value days, like we had the past couple of days, you can use what's called a composite profile, where you combine those profiles together and you can see where that overlapping value is, where the value high is, the value low, the POC, what's the overlapping shape. So typically what we like to do is we like to have an impulse day, the kind of day that started that overlap, right? And then you have the next day after the impulse where you didn't quite push away from that impulse. You tried to find higher value, tried to find lower value, didn't really find any, right? You kind of stayed relatively close to that POC or that value node from that impulse. Typically what we call a micro pullback day, right? A micro pullback is typically whenever you have a strong impulse and then you have like a doji on the daily that doesn't really push away from that strong impulse. It's kind of when the traders from the impulse were taking profit, right? So in this case, we had that strong impulse to the upside. Then we had that choppy day on Tuesday, or sorry, was it Wednesday? It was Wednesday. The choppy day on Wednesday where those buyers were taking profit. Okay. So we grab that composite profile. If you guys are on TradingView, it's called the fixed range volume profile. And you can grab it and you can kind of determine where you want to stop it, right? So we can start it on that impulse and we can grab it all the way until the current price action, right? So this would give us a bit of a P-shaped profile over the last couple of trading days because we have that impulse up and then we have the 3 choppy days back to back. Now, how can we actually use that in our trading? So if you guys remember today, at the start of the day, let's go back to the start here. This is what that profile looked like. Let me go ahead and hide the other profile so it's not so choppy here. And you can see what we're looking at. So we have that start of the value, and then this is where the value ended. We're pulling from these 2 points here. So this creates a bit of a P-shaped profile. We have that long lower tail. We have that weak upper tail. And then we have that big POC node towards the top, right? So with that big POC node here, we typically are leaning slightly bullish, right? As long as those buyers are protecting that value low, you want to start pushing that value high and trying to find higher value, okay? But in the meantime, as long as you are protecting that value high, you're just rotating back and forth. You're selling the value high, you're buying the value low, right? Rinse and repeat. You're just balancing on that upper node. So basically, when you try to find higher value, when you are pushing above that multi-day range, you're pushing above that multi-day value high. If you look above and fail, right, you fail to find that higher value, and it returns back to that value high as resistance, then obviously you're just going to go back to that value low. You're going to rotate back downward, right? So that could give you a pretty decent sell trade in the short term. Now, obviously, long term, you're still bullish as long as you protect that value low. But in the short term, you can sell that value high and look for that rotation back to that value low. The same way you would do it if it was a single day P-shaped profile, right? So you treat the composite shapes the same way you would treat that volume profile shape as if it was only one day. Okay. So at the start of today, we lost that value high and then we rotated back down to that composite value low. And that's where it found the buy pressure. The buyers came in on that composite value low, right around 60. And then you started to rotate back up. Now, this looks a little bit bearish because look at where we failed. This was a failure to rotate because we wanted to go back towards that 95, but it stalled out on that POC. And then look at how we closed. We closed relatively close to that value low. So basically the same way you would treat a normal P-shaped profile on a single day is if you start to be bottom heavy and you start to resist that POC and start to push that value low, then it looks pretty bearish, looking for that push down into that lower tail. Now, obviously today's Friday, so we can't really look for that until Monday, but that would be our trade plan moving forward into Monday, is if we continue to push that value low, we're going to look for that value retrace of that lower tail. Okay, so one thing to look at with NASDAQ is you had that same pattern. It wasn't as much of a P shape, but we were already failing that value low pretty early. And you had a pretty decent amount of sell pressure pushing down into Tuesday's value low. And that was the bottom damn near to the tick. So you had a little bit of sell pressure below that composite value low, which led to your single day value lows lower than that. Okay. So that's one way you can use these composite profiles in your trading. When you see that impulse, that strong impulse, either to the upside or downside, but then after that impulse, you have overlapping value days. Typically after that second micro pullback day, you can start pulling one of these composite profiles. And you can still look at the individual profiles if you want to, but really when you're ranging back and forth inside of this overlapping POC, you want to understand where that overlapping value high or value low are, so you can know where those larger rotations are going. Okay. And you also want to look for stuff like this, where you have that larger failure to rotate, right? Where we didn't quite make it back to that range high. You failed a little bit early. So it indicates that we are pretty bearish going into next week. Okay. Now, a couple of other things I wanted to show you before we call it a video here is I wanted to show you some other things on today's price action. Another thing with today's price action is we opened up and we immediately started selling. We did not have a single TPO above the open. So we very quickly started turning into a lowercase b. Now, what we know about lowercase b's on a volume profile shape is you are safe to be a seller typically. So sellers at the value high, sellers at the POC, you typically want to be close to the value high. But if you really have to, you can sell VWAP, sell the POC, and then look for the value low, look for that extension of the value low. So that would have been basically down to about 70. And that's where that value low started to really flatten out. Now, one thing I wanted to show you is with that 70 value low on ES here, is you can be a buyer on the value low of a lowercase b, but you need to be careful because the lowercase b typically implies that there is a bearish imbalance. What they want to do is they want to push that value low and extend that lower tail. And that's kind of what happened on the second half of today, where you pushed down around like 11:30, 11:45. You extended that lower tail by about 10 points. So the lower tail, or sorry, the value low was around 470. And we finally failed to rotate. You hit VWAP, and then you push that value low down about 10 points, lowering that lower tail. So you didn't have that very flat value low. You could see a lot of the TPOs were kind of lining up there for a bit. But yeah, once you push that tail, you came back to that rotation. So that kind of shows you what I was talking about, where you can be a buyer on the value low. You just need to be careful because you are trading the buy side on a bearish imbalanced day. And you can see that for pretty much the entire day we were selling VWAP. Every retest of VWAP was being sold. Most of them were the daily VWAP. Some of them were the session VWAP. And that is very common on a lowercase b day, right? The opposite would be true on a capital P day, like we showed on that composite profile. Because what happens on a capital P would be the opposite of today, right? VWAP is slowly trailing below you, and you go back down to retest VWAP, and they buy the VWAP. Typically, that can happen if they're failing to rotate, and they're not making it back down to that value low. Okay. But not to confuse you, let's take a look at just today, where the lowercase b was selling VWAP, right? You get a lot of those bear flags into VWAP, because typically the value high would be either where VWAP is or slightly above VWAP. So instead of rotating back into that value high, you're selling the POC or you're selling VWAP back down to the value low. And they rinse and repeat that, kind of like a bouncing ball, right? Every time the ball bounces, the momentum gets weaker and weaker and weaker, and finally, it breaks that level, right? You finally break that value low, you go for that lower tail extension. And if it's a very bearish day, instead of just extending the lower tail, it goes into a complete value shift to the downside, where it keeps building up value lower and lower until you finally shift that POC down and it becomes a bearish trend day, not just a lowercase b. Okay, today's example is more of a failure to find lower value. So you had a lowercase b, you pushed downward, but you could not find significant value below that value low. So what did it do? It returned back to the POC, returned back to VWAP. If you can't find lower or higher value, you always retreat back to value. It's a magnet, right? That value pulls you back. So the POC pulled you back, the VWAP pulled you back, and it just kept doing that rinse and repeat. Tried to go lower, couldn't do it. Back to VWAP. Tried to go lower, couldn't do it. Back to VWAP. Okay, so look for that pattern. The pattern that we saw today, where you just keep getting magnetically pulled back to VWAP on these lowercase b days, very, very common when you see that lowercase b get established rather quickly, rather early in the day. And look for that same pattern on a P-shaped day as well, but for the buyers, right? Where the VWAP is acting as support, you try to find higher value, fails, comes back down, and you keep bouncing off VWAP. Okay, very common pattern. Make sure to keep an eye on it. If you guys have any questions about the composite profiles or the capital P, lowercase b type trading days, feel free to put them in the comments. If you guys enjoyed this video, hit that like button. Be sure to subscribe. If you guys want to support the channel, you can use code BREW in Apex. It's 80% off right now. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace, everybody.